There you are, little dreamer. Come close now, wrap that blanket up under your chin, and let Grandpa tell you something gentle for the night. The rain's falling just right, steady, soft, like fingers tapping on a wooden windowsill. The fire's warm and the teacup is full. Now then, let's begin. There once was a town built in the arms of two low hills, where the clouds liked to nap, and the wind always carried the scent of something blooming. In that town lived an old clockmaker named Elias, whose little shop sat tucked between a sleepy bakery and a vine-covered post office. His sign had long since faded, but everyone knew the smell of wood polish and the sound of ticking that greeted them whenever they passed his door. Elias had been fixing time for nearly 60 years, not just clocks and watches, but heirlooms, grandfather pieces, cuckoos, and pocket fobs passed down from long-gone ancestors. But what most didn't know, not really, was that behind his quiet ticking shop, Elias kept a garden. Not just any garden, mind you, a secret one, a quiet sanctuary tucked behind a crooked gate and a wall of ivy, where time didn't quite behave the same. In that garden, flowers bloomed even in winter, sunlight stretched long into dusk, and the air smelled like memory, like warm bread, childhood laughter, and the kind of quiet only found when everything in the world slows down. The clocks Elias fixed were just part of his work. His true joy came from planting small seeds while whispering stories to them, tales of love, loss, joy, and peace, and watching those stories bloom as blossoms unlike any other. Some flowers ticked softly when you leaned close, their petals fluttering like pages. Others swayed in perfect rhythm with faraway winds no one else seemed to feel. Elias didn't keep this garden for fame or wonder. He kept it because somewhere deep in his soul he believed that when someone's heart had lost its rhythm, from grief, from loneliness, from simply living too fast, they could find healing in a place where time paused, just long enough to catch their breath. And one rainy morning, just like this one, someone knocked on his door, someone who didn't know yet that her life was about to change. The knock came gently at first, like a question asked with hesitation. 1, 2, then silence. Elias, who had been carefully adjusting the tiny escapement of an antique carriage clock, paused and looked up through his smudged glasses. It wasn't often anyone knocked on his door during the rain, not unless they truly needed something. He stood slowly, wiping his hands on a soft cloth, and opened the door with the usual creak that echoed down the cobbled lane. There, on his step, stood a girl of about 13, soaked from the rain, despite a threadbare hood pulled over her head. Her cheeks were pink with cold, and her eyes,
her eyes were heavy with the kind of sorrow too deep for her young face. Are you the one who fixes things?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper over the patter of the rain. Elias looked at her quietly for a long moment, not with suspicion, not with worry, but with a kindness as steady as the ticking clocks behind him. "I try," he said gently, "though sometimes fixing looks a little different than folks expect." The girl hesitated, then reached into the folds of her damp coat and pulled out a small broken pocket watch. The glass was cracked, its hands frozen just past midnight, and its brass casing dulled by time. "It belonged to my brother," she said, eyes cast downward. He's not here anymore, and it stopped the night he left." Elias took the watch without a word and studied it, not just the gears or springs, but the sadness clinging to it like dust. He could feel it, humming quiet and deep. "This one doesn't just need oil and polish," he said softly. "It needs time." She nodded, as though she understood, though perhaps she didn't quite know what that meant. Elias stepped aside and motioned her in from the cold. "Come in, warm yourself. And when the rain lightens, perhaps you'd like to see the garden." The girl blinked. "Garden." Elias smiled faintly. "Where time goes to rest and sometimes to bloom again." And with that, the clockmaker's door closed behind them, not as an end, but the start of something neither of them could yet name. The rain softened into a misty drizzle by afternoon, casting a silvery glow across the glass panes of the old shop. Inside, Elias had brewed a pot of tea that smelled of clove and orange peel, its steam curling like whispers through the cozy ticking of dozens of clocks. The girl, whose name was Mira, sat curled on a worn velvet chair near the hearth, her damp coat now hanging by the fire, and her fingers wrapped tightly around a warm teacup. She hadn't spoken much, and Elias hadn't asked much. He let the silence stretch between them like a safe, thick quilt, knowing full well that sometimes hearts spoke best in the hush between words. When she finally looked up, her eyes were still rimmed with the kind of sadness that doesn't fade in a single afternoon. "You said something about a garden," she said softly, as though testing whether it had truly been spoken. Elias stood and gave her a small, knowing nod. He walked to the back of the shop, where most thought the walls ended, but just beside a grandfather clock taller than a man, there was a narrow door tucked behind a curtain of thick ivy that had long crept through the window and made a home for itself. Elias parted the ivy gently, as if greeting an old friend, and opened the door. The moment Mira stepped through, her breath caught. The garden was not large, but it felt endless. Time did strange things here. The air shimmered, heavy with scent and silence. Flowers of every imaginable color bloomed in perfect stillness. Some had petals shaped like stars. Others hung low like lanterns, glowing faintly with inner light. Trees with silver bark and blue leaves swayed to no breeze Mira could feel, and the soil beneath her feet felt warm and soft, as though it remembered every step ever taken. She wandered slowly, cautiously, as if afraid that even her breath might disturb the balance. Elias followed at a quiet pace, stopping near a small stone bench shaped like an open book. "This place doesn't run on hours and minutes," he said gently. "It runs on feeling, on memory. Some plants bloom with sorrow, some with hope. Some don't bloom at all until someone sits beside them and simply waits." Mira knelt near a cluster of delicate white blossoms. Their petals trembled slightly, making the faintest ticking sound, like a lullaby counting seconds. She didn't speak, but something in her eyes changed, softened, perhaps. The garden didn't ask her to be happy. It didn't ask her to move on. It simply existed with her. Elias watched her quietly and thought to himself, yes, this is where her healing might begin. Mira returned to the garden the next day and the next, as if drawn by something she couldn't quite name. Each visit felt a little easier. The sadness she carried didn't disappear. Oh no, that kind of ache doesn't vanish like mist. But in the garden, It stopped pressing so heavily against her ribs. It softened into something she could hold without falling apart. The flowers seemed to sense her, and new ones had bloomed where she sat. Quiet spirals of midnight blue petals that smelled faintly of lavender and rain. She called them dream bells, and Elias smiled when she did, for though he had cared for this garden for many years, he had never seen those before. That was the way of the garden. It gave back to those who brought something of themselves. Mira had unknowingly planted something precious. Grief turned to remembrance. Sorrow turned to care. And the garden answered with beauty, born from pain. One morning Elias handed Mira a tiny trowel and a cloth pouch filled with seeds the color of dusk. "These," he said gently, "only grow when planted with a memory." Mira looked at him curiously. "Not just any memory," he added, "but one you're ready to share, not out loud, not to me, just to the earth." Mira took the pouch with quiet hands and wandered into the far corner of the garden, where a weeping willow arched protectively overhead. There she knelt and pressed her fingers into the soil. She stayed that way for a long while, unmoving, save for the occasional blink or tremble of her lips. Then slowly she reached into the pouch and began to plant. She whispered as she did, not loudly, not for anyone to hear, but just enough to let the memory breathe. A brother's laugh, the way he used to tap his fingers in rhythm on the kitchen table, the way he'd once tied a red ribbon to her bike and said it made her faster, the way the house felt quieter now. She buried these words like seeds, and as her hands grew dirty, her shoulders loosened. She didn't expect anything in return, but when she finally looked down, the soil she had pressed glowed faintly. Not bright, not flashy, just warm. And a single green sprout curled out from the ground, stretching up like it had been waiting for her all along. Elias, watching from the bench, smiled. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Days turned into weeks, but inside the garden, time moved differently. Not slower, just softer. Mira found herself slipping into a rhythm that felt like a secret melody, shared only between her heart and the soil beneath her feet. Each morning she came to Elias's shop just as the bell atop the bakery next door chimed once, and each evening she left, as the garden's shadows grew long and lavender-colored. With every visit, the garden seemed to recognize her more. Flowers leaned toward her like old friends. The branches of trees arched protectively over her path, and even the breeze seemed to carry a gentle welcome. It was as if the garden had begun to shape itself around her, sensing not only her pain, but also her quiet strength, the part of her that still hoped, even when it didn't realize it. One day, while Mira was tracing her fingers along the bark of a tree that hummed faintly when touched, Elias appeared beside her with a curious object in hand. It was a timepiece, small, delicate, its gears exposed behind a pane of amber glass. "This one," he said, "never kept time quite the way others do. It doesn't count seconds or minutes. It records something else entirely, moments that matter." Mira took the piece gently and watched as the hands ticked forward, not in regular rhythm, but with a soft click every time she smiled, or thought of her brother, or felt that strange calm that only the garden gave her. "You see," Elias continued, "some clocks aren't made to measure time. They're made to measure life." Mira didn't speak, but her fingers curled protectively around the small timepiece, as if it were something fragile and sacred. She understood. in the quiet way children sometimes do, that this was not just a gift, but a way to remember without being swallowed by sadness. She wore it around her neck on a fine silver chain, and each time it ticked, it felt like a heartbeat, reminding her, "You are here, you are living, this moment matters." And so the garden grew, not just with flowers, but with healing. It became a tapestry woven with memory and new beginnings. And for the first time in a very long time, Mira laughed, not loudly, not even for long, but it was real. And oh, how the garden bloomed that day. The day Mira laughed, truly laughed, something deep within the garden stirred, something older than time, older even than Elias. It wasn't a sound or a shift in the air, but more a feeling that passed like a breeze through the trees, awakening roots and petals alike. Flowers bloomed where none had before, violet ones shaped like tiny hourglasses, and others the color of twilight that opened only when Mira stood near. The soft ticking beneath the garden grew richer, layered, like more clocks had joined in, each one set to the rhythm of her returning heart. Even Elias paused beneath the sun-dappled branches and looked around with quiet awe. "She's listening to you," he whispered, placing a gentle hand on the trunk of an old tree whose bark bore grooves like ancient script. "And you're listening back." That afternoon, as they sat beneath a canopy of golden leaves that shimmered like candlelight, Elias told her the truth, not just about the garden, but about himself. He had not always been a clockmaker. Once, long ago, he had been a traveler, not across lands, but across moments. "There was a time," he said, "when I tried to fix everything, every broken person, every sad ending, every missed goodbye. I thought if I could just rewind or pause or skip forward, I could heal the world." Mira listened with wide, searching eyes as Elias spoke. "But time, child, time is not a machine. It isn't something to fix. It's something to feel. That's what the garden taught me." Mira turned her gaze to the blossoms dancing in slow, rhythmic sways and whispered, "So it listens to broken hearts?" Elias smiled and nodded, "Yes, and it holds them gently until they begin to beat again." He leaned back on the bench, his eyes half closed. "But it needs people like you to visit, people brave enough to bring their sorrow, people kind enough to leave behind hope." Mira looked down at the ticking timepiece resting just above her heart. Its hands had moved again, not by the clock on the wall, but by the clock inside her chest. The next morning the rain returned, not in heavy sheets, but in a gentle hush that made the rooftops glisten and turned the garden paths into glimmering ribbons. Mira arrived earlier than usual, her boots squishing quietly as she stepped through the ivy-covered gate. She had begun to walk without hesitation now, weaving through the stone archways and flower beds as if the garden itself had taught her the path. Elias wasn't in the shop when she came, nor was he in the garden, but she didn't worry. The garden had a way of making her feel safe even when alone. Today, something felt different. A stillness, not of absence, but of anticipation, like the moment before a music box plays its first note. Mira wandered deeper than she ever had before, past the silver birches that bowed like dancers, past the bellflowers that chimed softly with each breeze. She followed a winding path she hadn't noticed before, one veiled in mist and flanked by bushes that shimmered faintly with dew-kissed blossoms. At the end of this path stood a tree unlike any other in the garden. It was tall, towering, with a trunk as wide as the fireplace in Elias's shop, and its bark pulsed gently with golden veins that glowed softly, like the inside of a pocket watch come to life. Hanging from its branches were small wooden tags, each with names etched into them in delicate, swirling script. The tree was quiet, reverent, sacred. Mira approached it slowly, her fingers grazing one of the hanging tags. The moment she touched it, warmth spread up her arm, and a memory not her own played softly in her mind. The laughter of a stranger, a whisper of goodbye, a song hummed by someone long ago. She stepped back, wide-eyed, and realized this was the memory tree, a resting place for stories, for moments too precious to be lost to time. Every tag was a piece of someone's heart, left here in trust, to be remembered. And the tree, the garden, held them all gently, without judgment. She reached into her coat and took out her brother's broken watch, which she had carried each day, even as she wore Elias's gift around her neck. She knelt at the base of the tree and, with hands that trembled just slightly, placed it among the roots. "You'll be safe here," she whispered. "You were always more than minutes and hours." The tree pulsed faintly in response, and above her one more tag appeared, newly formed, freshly inscribed, with a name only she truly knew. Mira stood slowly, her eyes misty, but her heart steady. The rain fell softly, and somewhere in the distance the ticking of the garden quickened, not with urgency, but with purpose. The moment mattered. Mira didn't speak much that day, not even when Elias returned and found her seated quietly beneath the memory tree, her back resting against its trunk, eyes turned upward toward the dangling tags that moved like wind chimes. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He simply settled on the bench nearby, placed 2 warm cups of tea between them, and waited. That was the way of the garden. It taught patience not with lessons, but with presence. Eventually, Mira reached for the tea and took a sip, the steam curling past her cheek like a breath from the earth itself. And then, without looking at him, she said softly, "I think I understand now." Elias looked at her with those kind, time-worn eyes. "Understand what, child?" "That the watch, the one that stopped when my brother left." She paused, steadying her breath. "It didn't break. It just finished its time." Her voice didn't crack the way it once might have. The sadness was still there, yes, but now it sat beside her like a companion instead of a shadow. "I thought if I fixed it, maybe I could hold on to him longer, but I don't need it to tick to remember him." The old clockmaker gave a slow nod, setting down his tea with care. "Some things are meant to be remembered, not repaired. Time has a way of folding around the people we've loved. They're never truly gone. They just become part of the rhythm inside us." They sat in silence for a long while after that, listening to the gentle rustling of leaves, the occasional creak of a wooden tag shifting in the breeze, and the quiet,
constant ticking that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. And then, something small and wonderful happened. A tiny sprout grew from the soil beneath where Mira sat, unfurling with quiet grace. Its petals were silver, shaped like the hands of a clock, and its stem was so thin it swayed with her breath. She didn't need to ask what it was. The garden had accepted her offering, her memory, and returned it in the form of beauty, of quiet life. That night, as she left the garden through the ivy-covered door, she felt taller somehow. Not in stature, but in spirit. She hadn't moved on, no, not that. She had grown forward, carrying what mattered and letting go of what didn't. And Elias, watching her go, whispered to himself, "She's blooming." The next time Mira arrived, something felt different. Not in the garden, which still hummed softly with its living stillness, but within herself. It was as though her footsteps no longer echoed with the ache of what she had lost, but carried the quiet strength of someone who had walked through the storm and found shelter. She paused in the doorway of the garden, one hand resting on the frame, as if greeting an old friend before entering. And the garden responded, of course it did. A breeze stirred the petals along the walkway. Birdsong rose softly in the trees above, and the blossoms turned their faces toward her. She belonged here now, not as a guest, but as a keeper of something precious. Elias was in the center of the garden today, kneeling by a sundial that hadn't cast a shadow in years. It wasn't broken, just resting, as he often said. He looked up when she approached, his face breaking into a smile that crinkled all the soft corners of his eyes. "I think the garden has a gift for you," he said, standing and brushing soil from his hands. He pointed toward a narrow path, overgrown and veiled in ferns, one Mira had never walked before. "It only opens when you're ready." Without hesitation, Mira stepped forward. The path was quiet, muffled like a dream, and it twisted gently through thicker trees whose trunks were etched with faint lines like musical notes. As she walked, those notes turned into whispers, not in words, but in feelings. Comfort, remembrance, peace. The path opened into a small glade where a single tree stood in the center, its bark smooth and silver, its branches low and wide like arms waiting to embrace. Beneath it sat a bench carved from the same wood, and on that bench, resting in a
painted not with ink, but with light and scent and sound, like the garden had remembered for her, holding the pieces she hadn't known she could lose. She didn't cry, not this time. She smiled, deeply with gratitude, and ran her fingers over the glowing pages. The garden had taken her pain and given her something more than comfort. It had given her story back. And back in the center of the garden, Elias stood with eyes closed and heart full. He knew what that path meant. It meant she was no longer a visitor. She was becoming part of the garden. Mira returned from the glade not as a child lost in sorrow, but as someone who had stepped through her own past and come out the other side stronger, rooted. Elias saw it immediately, the way she held herself, the calm steadiness in her eyes, the way the garden no longer responded to her arrival like it was welcoming her, but rather like it had been waiting for her to come home. He placed a hand on her shoulder, light as the mist that hung above the petals, and said with that quiet, sure voice, "You've reached the heart of it." That day, Elias handed her something precious, the key to a small wooden cabinet that stood hidden in a hollow near the garden center. Inside it were journals, dozens of them, bound in worn leather and filled with delicate script. Mira opened one, and her breath caught. These were the memories of others who had come before her. Some pages held sketches of flowers now long gone, others told short, aching tales of sorrow and love. of farewells whispered into the roots of trees, of hopes planted beneath the soil. The garden, it turned out, was not just a sanctuary. It was a living library of hearts. And now, it was Mira's turn to write. Elias led her to a quiet corner where a small desk sat beneath an overhanging arch of moon-colored blossoms. He placed a blank journal in front of her. "Not everything in life needs to be remembered," he said softly, "but what we choose to remember shapes who we become." Mira took the quill and began to write. Not about her grief, not only that, but about her brother's smile, about the garden's soft rain, about the way her heart had started ticking again in time with the flowers. The words flowed like water that had been waiting behind a dam, gentle and free. The garden stilled around her as if listening, and Elias sat quietly at a distance, watching the final lines of the chapter he had been part of for so long being written by new hands. He had kept the garden long enough. Now it belonged to someone else. Night fell gently over the hills, and the first stars blinked into the sky like tiny promises. But don't you worry, dear one. The story doesn't end here. The stars shimmered overhead as if the sky itself had leaned a little closer to listen, to peek into the garden where a girl named Mira now sat as more than a guest. She was the garden's memory keeper. That night, as the moonlight painted silver ribbons through the trees, Mira wrote late into the hours when the world grew quiet. Her hand moved across the pages with grace, as though her soul had waited years to speak in ink. Each word she wrote wasn't just a memory, it was a seed. And the garden, oh, the garden understood. As each sentence bloomed from her pen, small glowing buds opened in the flower beds around her, reflecting the thought she had given voice to. A laugh shared with her brother by a stream, the sound of footsteps echoing down a hallway that would never again hold his voice. The peace she felt now beneath the branches of the memory tree. Elias, from a little distance, watched with the satisfaction of a gardener who had seen the first blossom of spring after a long winter. He had never forced the garden to change. He had only guided it, listened to it. But now it responded to Mira like a companion, and as he leaned back in his chair, carved from driftwood and time, he remembered his own first days in the garden, how the silence had frightened him before he learned to trust it. And now the silence was filled, not with noise, but with meaning. As dawn began to creep into the horizon, Mira closed the journal gently and looked toward Elias, who now seemed not old, but timeless. "Will it always be here?" she asked. "The garden?" Elias smiled softly, his eyes reflecting the pink hue of the waking sky. "As long as someone remembers, as long as someone believes that healing isn't a place, but a journey made step by step." Mira didn't answer right away. She looked out over the garden, now shimmering with dew, and nodded slowly. "Then I'll remember. I'll keep walking." And as the first golden rays of morning reached the petals, Mira stood and turned back toward the garden's path, journal tucked close to her chest. She wasn't running from her sorrow anymore. She was walking with it, letting it bloom beside her, part of the beauty she now chose to carry. Mira's footsteps on the garden path felt different now, deliberate, calm, almost rhythmic. The ticking timepiece around her neck moved in gentle sync with her breath, not to count seconds, but to honor the life she was beginning to shape anew. The garden had become more than a refuge. It was now a mirror, quietly reflecting the growth blooming inside her. Even the oldest parts of it, once quiet and still, now stirred faintly as if acknowledging her presence, like an old tree shifting slightly to greet the wind. And somewhere between the ivy-covered gate and the tree-lined path, Mira felt something new awakening within her. Purpose. It wasn't just about healing anymore, it was about tending, not just to her memories, but to others. She began to wonder how many people pass through life silently aching, never finding a garden of their own. So that morning, as golden sunlight bathed the mossy stones in warmth, she turned to Elias with a question that had taken root quietly. "Has anyone ever shared the garden?" she asked. "Not just visited, but invited someone in?" Elias's smile came slowly, like the lifting of fog. "Very few," he said, "because few have the heart to hold both their own sorrow and someone else's at the same time. But you, child, you're different. The garden speaks loudest to those who listen, even when the words are not their own." And so, with trembling resolve, Mira chose to open the garden, not with signs or announcements, but with quiet intention. She cleared a small bench near the memory tree and placed a second journal beside it. She tucked a few dried dream bells into the pages and left a small note. "You are welcome here." That very evening a boy stepped in through the gate. He was quiet, shoulders hunched, eyes shadowed, not by darkness, but by something deeper, weariness. Mira didn't rush him, didn't speak. She simply nodded once and pointed to the bench. He sat. He didn't write, not yet. But he stayed. That was enough. Later, Elias whispered to the blossoms overhead, "The garden has begun again." The boy returned the next day, and the day after that, always at the same time. Just as the first light of sunset began to stretch through the garden like long golden fingers reaching between the trees. His name, as Mira would come to learn, was Leor, and though he spoke little, his silence was not empty. It was careful, like someone who had built walls not out of anger, but to keep precious things from being scattered by the wind. Mira didn't push. She simply sat nearby each evening, tending to the memory tree, watering the roots, scribbling in her journal, humming softly to the flowers that responded with gentle pulses of color. It was a quiet companionship, the kind that doesn't need to be named to be felt. Then, one evening, Leor reached for the second journal she had left beside the bench. He didn't open it at first. He simply held it, turning it over in his hands like a stone he wasn't sure he wanted to skip yet. Mira continued to hum, letting the rhythm fill the space between them. Finally, slowly, he opened the cover and began to write. Mira didn't look. She didn't need to. The garden would listen. That was enough. And as the first lines of Leor's story flowed onto the page, something subtle stirred beneath the roots of the garden, not visible to the eye, but felt deeply, like a low drumbeat in the earth. The garden was expanding, not in size, but in heart. Elias watched from a distance, his face a map of contentment. The garden had always been more than a sanctuary. It was a promise that no sorrow need remain buried, that no memory was too small to matter. And now, with Mira and Leor both writing, both planting, both becoming, the garden bloomed with a new rhythm, a shared song. Flowers Mira had never seen before appeared near Leor's bench, clusters of soft blue and green, shaped like tear droplets held together by light. She asked Elias about them once, and he only said, "Those are called remembrance blooms. They grow where a sorrow is finally spoken out loud, even if only to paper." One evening Mira returned to the memory tree and found that a third journal had appeared, not placed by Elias or by her, just there, waiting. It had a leaf pressed between the first 2 pages and the faint scent of rain. The garden had begun to write back. When Mira found it beneath the memory tree, she sat with it in her lap for a long while, feeling its weight, not heavy like a burden, but meaningful like a gift you didn't know you'd been waiting for. Its cover was dark green, soft like moss, and its pages, when she opened them, smelled faintly of cedar and rain. But what struck her most was that the first few lines weren't hers. They weren't Elias's. They weren't Lior's. They were the garden's. Written in looping script that shimmered faintly under the afternoon light were the words, "What is remembered here stays alive in more than memory." Mira touched the ink gently. It was warm, fresh. The garden had spoken. From that moment on, the air within the garden held a deeper charge, not frightening, but alive. Flowers bloomed in colors Mira had no names for. The sundial, dormant for decades, began to turn slowly in rhythm with the journaling hours, and when Lior returned the next evening, he walked straighter, spoke a few words, and even smiled, a rare quiet smile that Mira returned without hesitation. They didn't talk about the journal, not yet. But both of them felt it. The garden was no longer just holding their stories. It was weaving them together. Elias, who had become more like the wind than a man now, always present, always watching, but never quite needing to speak, sat beneath the oldest tree one evening and watched the 2 children move through the garden like stars orbiting the same sky. "It was never meant to be mine forever," he murmured to a passing breeze. "It was meant to be shared." Later that week another journal appeared, this one small, bound in bark and stitched with tiny threads of gold. A young girl from the town, who had followed the sound of Mira's humming and the trail of flower petals scattered along the sidewalk, stepped quietly through the ivy gate. Mira welcomed her with nothing more than a smile and a nod, the same welcome she had once received. The girl found the new journal waiting on a stone ledge beneath a tree that shimmered with light only children seemed to notice, and just like that, the garden grew again, not in size, but in soul. Each journal, each story, each name remembered by the roots and the rain, it all pulsed quietly beneath their feet like a heartbeat made of soil and love. So, shall we follow the rhythm into the very last part of this story, my dear listener? Grandpa's voice is soft now, but steady. The final chapter of the garden's tale didn't come with fanfare, nor did it need to. It arrived on a morning wrapped in quiet, the kind of silence filled not with emptiness, but with reverence. Dew hung like crystal threads between the petals. The sundial stood still, not because it had stopped working, but because time, for just a while, no longer needed measuring. Mira stood beneath the memory tree, now taller than before, its branches heavy with countless hanging tags, names, moments, wishes, losses, and loves. Around her were others, Lior with a smudge of ink on his cheek, the girl who had come through the ivy gate now leading a small boy by the hand, and more still arriving, drawn not by signs or invitations, but by something deeper, a knowing, a call. The garden had grown through them, and because of them, and now it was theirs. Elias stood at the garden's edge. He looked smaller than before, but also brighter somehow, like the fading of a candle not because it's gone out, but because the sun has risen. He met Mira's eyes and gave a small bow of the head, as if to say, "It is yours now." Then he turned slowly and stepped through the ivy archway one last time. No one stopped him. No one needed to. The garden would remember him, in every ticking leaf, in every journal page fluttered by the breeze, in every story whispered beneath the branches. Mira walked to the center of the garden, where a new bench had grown. Yes, grown, as if carved by time itself from the roots of the memory tree. She placed a journal on it, the one with the garden's first words. On the inside cover, she wrote, "Welcome, you are safe here." Then she stepped back and listened. Tick, tick, tick. It wasn't a clock this time. It was the sound of pages turning. One by one the journals began to open themselves. Soft light poured from them like breath, curling into the air and drifting toward the sky, carrying with it every sorrow that had ever been planted, now transformed into peace. And the garden whispered back, "You're not alone. You were never alone. You are home." So now, dear dreamer, let Grandpa tuck you in with this final thought. Even when the world grows too loud, even when your heart aches quietly in the dark, there is a garden, maybe not made of leaves and flowers, but of memories and kindness, and it waits for you. Good night now. Rest your eyes. The garden will keep watch.